The dabbing technique is super easy. It's a little more kind of like a a mixture of a wash and kind of a tap. Like you're tapping your paintbrush onto the surface, but you're using a color that's more like a wash. So don't be afraid to have like a brush that has some water in it, but you don't want to necessarily have it dripping everywhere either. So think of some fall colors while you're doing that. Now, depending, do you want your wash super strong? If so, spend a little more time in your paint palette. Do you want your wash kind of thin and kind of, almost translucent and see-through? And then end up building some of that shadow on top of layer number 1? Then use less paint and more water. Mine's kind of see-through. I have a lot of water, very little paint, and I'm literally tapping the wash onto my paper. Don't worry about perfect shapes here. I'm doing blobs of color. Specifically because when you look further back into space, you're less likely to see as much detail because there's dust and particles in the air that mess with your vision. So these trees are way further back in the background, so they're going to be way less detailed than your owl. We're literally just applying layer number 1. It's going to be kind of loosey-goosey, a little wet, a little translucent. That's okay. This is your filler shade. Just dab around your owl. I'm going to put some over here too. These are going to be your fall trees. Just keep working across your paper. Don't worry about adding your second layer or your shadow right now. We're literally kind of blocking in where the tree is going to be using blobs of color. And then we'll go back and we'll add an additional layer for our shadowy clusters. You know how trees kind of have clusters of shadow that are darker and areas that are lighter? That's kind of what we're going for here. We're doing the lighter areas first. I don't like how light this area is, so I am going to add an additional layer of color. All right. This, see how it's shiny still? It's way too wet to add layer number 2. Way too wet. Way too wet. While you're waiting for layer number 2, let's add our tree trunks with our baby brush. Feel free to have less water this time. More paint. Think of kind of like a really strong line, so you're not going to need a lot of water. You're going to need more paint. And you want a lot of paint on your brush. Remember that flicking technique I was teaching you about with your wrist, where you flick with your wrist? Well, you're going to flick in your tree trunks. Now, I'm only doing this area. I haven't drawn in my background or what it's going to look like, and you know what? That is okay. Maybe I'll do that while I wait for my paint to dry. Now, this is called an angle shader. It's great for getting really thin kind of line strokes. And it's great for getting into tiny areas like your crescent. It has multiple different uses. So if you don't have one, I highly recommend getting one. All right. So I know you're still working, but literally it's repeating the first step. Once your surface is dry, not cool, not damp, dry. Like literally you touch it and it's like room temperature, there's no moisture. Then you're going to add layer number 2 using the dabbing technique. More paint, less water. So squeeze out that extra water. I'm going to do it over here so you can see it on this red tree. The orange is what we're kind of getting here. We're kind of aiming for. You're going to get darker colors by using less water. Here's my shadowy clumps. And if you don't like how dark it is, you can use that lift technique I taught you earlier to lift the color out of the paper if you don't like how dark it's getting. Because I have a feeling this is getting pretty intense here. I kind of like this more. You see that? You see how it's kind of gradual? So let's say I don't like it and I want to fix it, right? Lift. It's lighter now. See? It all went on my thing. Ah! So that, my friend, is how you do trees. So I decided to get rid of the little house thing that I had in my previous drawing because I didn't like that, and instead I have decided to put a branch there. I am going to get a small rounded brush, probably about the size of my pinky nail, and I am going to load it up with watercolor paint and just a small amount of water, and I'm just going to use some long fluid strokes to kind of create a branch underneath my owl's feet. I just think this is just a little more appropriate for what I'm looking for. Now if I want that branch to be darker, I'm going to have a lot more paint than I am water, and for this part of your project, you're going to want to make sure that you are using very little water and doing the dry on dry technique. Your paintbrush is mostly dry, your paper is super dry, and you have lots of paint and little water. It's going to give you that bold, crisp line you're looking for the edge of your branch. So, I highly recommend doing long fluid strokes to get that natural, flowy branch, realistic mark on the surface of your paper. Now, if you want that mark or that tree line to be a little bit darker, just wait for your first layer to dry and then reapply a second layer as needed. I am still not satisfied with the color brown I have here. It's way too similar to what I have in the background for my tree trunks. So I'm just going to add a very minuscule, meaning very tiny dot or droplet of black to my brush. And I'm going to kind of use that little droplet of black and kind of blend it into my still wet brown paint to create more of a muted dark brown shade for my tree limb. This is just going to create some contrast and help the viewer differentiate or see that the tree limb is actually a different color and a different object than the tree trunks. So you can also use color to create a sense of contrast too. Instead of just layering the color, you can add a different color on top if you choose to do so. Now, if you do this and you go with the darker color idea that I just introduced to you, make sure that you kind of, run your brush back and forth and blend it really well into the paper with a super light feathery touch. This is going to basically hand mix the paints on your paper so everything blends smoothly together. If not, you can have this really weird black line with a bright brown top, and that doesn't look really cool, does it? So if you want to have it more blended and look more natural, feather the color in with the color that you already have on your paper using a super light touch. Okay, so now that I am satisfied with my tree branch, I'm literally going to use a green wash all over the the area that is underneath my tree limb and my tree trunk. Now, a wash is using watered down watercolor paint where you use a strip of wet, clean water onto your paper, then a strip of color. Now, since I am really worried about my, what do you call it? My tree limb kind of bleeding into my hill color, I might even put down a dark strip of paint first and then kind of moisten or add like a few droplets of water to my brush, tap off the extra, and then feather the color out. That way I have more control over my watercolor paint and not risk having my loose water not risk having the loose water kind of touching the edge of my branches. I don't want that brown to bleed into my hillside. So that's an option too. But it's literally a watercolor wash. It's diluted watercolor paint, and we're literally making this entire area nice and green for our pasture that's going to be underneath our owl's tree branch and feet. So let's quick do that before adding anything else. Now you could just leave it this nice green color, or you can add an additional layer and separate this really big open space and create two different hills, one being a darker green and the other one being your original color. This is done by layering or adding an additional layer of watercolor paint on top of the surface of the paint that you've just put down. If you decide to do that, you're going to want to wait for that first layer to dry, and then you can also clean out your brush and use a combination of a small flat and a medium to large flat and kind of create some blue washes in the background for your horned owl's sky. Totally up to you. For the eyes, I'm definitely going to probably use a black Sharpie so that way I don't risk getting any of that brown paint or black paint splooging all over my poor little owl's face. So I'm going to use black Sharpie for that area so that way I can have a little more control over that finite amount of space. And that, my friend, is how to paint a horned owl using watercolor.